Hi everyone. I am super glad to see so many of you join us today. Um, my name is Fatla, and I'm so glad to be leading this event for you today. So this is our first DevTalks MentorMate webinar. So let me do a little introduction of what DevTalks is all about. So MentorMate DevTalks is a community for sharing knowledge for people in the software development industry, which people from MentorMate started in 2017. So our goal is to create a diversity of events which we can discuss best practices, tools, and ways to develop high quality software. So until now, we have developed more than 15 events in Bulgaria in 5 different cities. But this is our first webinar, so welcome. In today's event, we'll discuss API testing with Rest Assured. Our speaker is Ilya Yanev, and he's a senior automation QA and MentorMate. So here's how the event will go today. So Ilya will talk for around 40 to 45 minutes, and then we have a demo, and the last 10 minutes are scheduled for questions. So any questions you may have are very welcomed in the chat, which is located in the window, kind of in the middle of your screen. Okay, that was the intro. So I'll leave the words to Ilya now.
All right, so hi everyone from me as well. And Svetla already introduced me. My name is Ilya, and I'm an automation QA and MentorMate. And I have been a MentorMate for around 3 years. And I have been doing automation for more than 5. And today's presentation is about API testing and in particular API testing with Rest Assured. And before we start, I'll just talk a little bit about me. So in the project I've worked with very small clients in a project consisting about 7 people in total as a development team. I've worked with projects with more than 80 or 90. I don't even know what the count is right now. And in all of those, we found a similar issue, and it was pretty much when to test APIs, how extensive to test APIs, what tools to use to test APIs, and one of those tools, which is exactly Rest Assured, they want to cover today. And the agenda for today will be, we'll first talk about API testing in general, how to do it, why to do it. We'll go through Rest Assured, what it is, and then we'll dive deeper into Rest Assured features like how to validate API responses, how to handle complex JSON objects, how to authenticate in Rest Assured, and how to work with secure APIs. Then a very cool Rest Assured concept, which is called spec builders, and how we can make our tests a little bit more data-driven. And of course, at the end, we'll have a demo. That's the plan for today. And after the demo, as Svetlana mentioned, we'll have some questions. And in the meantime, yeah, feel free to post them in the chat. And we'll try to go over as many as we can. And let's start with why bother doing API testing at all. And there are many reasons to do it. One of them is they're saving a lot of time. And I guess everyone who's been in the software development industry has seen the pyramid on the right. Some people call it the impossible pyramid, but it's very possible actually. And you have obviously unit tests at the bottom, which are closer to your code. They're the fastest test, and they're the lower level test. You can test a method of your code with them. Then you go to the service API tests, in which you use to test your integration with your API systems. Then you go to the UI tests. And ideally, you should have that pyramid, because the further you go up, the slower your test becomes, because there are that much more setup at that many more systems that have to work properly for you to test that. And that pyramid is something that I think a lot of people strive for, not many achieve. And usually what happens is developers write unit tests, of course, but since they They write their code with a specific feature in mind. They imagine how it should work. They test, unit test a lot of the features, but most of the time, the positive path is covered. The negative paths, not always all of them. They miss some things. And the QAs, they start working from the top. In some cases, they say, all right, we're delivering a product, and how would our client consume our product? Probably through some UI, and they start going through the UI, writing a lot of tests for the UI, and instead of a pyramid, you have something which resembles, if you, yeah, I guess all of you saw a martini glass. Pretty much at the bottom, you have some tests. In the middle, you have very little, and at the top, you have a lot. And that's what happens to a lot of projects. You have a lot of UI tests, some unit tests, but most of the time, very lacking API test layer. And API test, why are they time saving? Well, the test itself is just make a call to an API and validate the response. That's it. And through the UI, let's say you have to log in, then before you log in, you have to open a browser first. You have to log in, you have to navigate to a specific page, you have to enter some information, you have to press a bunch of buttons. Then let's see if we got all the data that we need. Maybe it's on multiple pages, so you have to click. And you can see how slow and time consuming it becomes, and you have much more dependency that way. Another benefit of API testing and API testing tools is that APIs by design, they transfer data through data structures which are language independent, like JSON or XML. It doesn't matter what your API is written in. It can be written in Java, it can be written in .NET, in Python. It doesn't make a difference for API testing. It's less code. There are a lot less verbose than UI tests because there is that little setup involved. You can just send a request and that's it. And if you have a good API test layer, you can use that to help your UA test. So if you need the source of truth for your UA test, do I get the correct information here? What should I do? Well, you can call an API, and if you have a good API layer, you can integrate them into UA test very easily. And all of those factors combined lead to reduced development and testing costs, of course. And this is a graph that I wanted to show, which is from 10 years ago. From a study about 2010, but it's very relevant still today. It pretty much shows how the cost of repairing a defect changes in different stages of the software development lifecycle. And you can see that if you find a defect during coding, it's most people wouldn't even consider it a defect because, all right, I'm starting to write a piece of code. I found an issue, I fixed it, that's it. And you have no cost of increase overall there. And you can see as you go through unit test, the functional test phase, then to system or some UAT test, then to a release, the cost increases by a lot. And that happens not because the complexity of the issue changes, it's still the same piece of code that's the reason for a bug. The issue is that now so many more people got involved and you got in completely different life cycle. Let's say we found a bug in production. Who found it? Probably some client had an issue and he wrote a ticket. That ticket got converted to a support request. It reached the developers, and you know that once it reaches the developers, usually it goes through a grooming stage, a planning stage. Let's see what happened here. We have to see how is it a bug, is it not, and then we have to fix it. We have to make another branch, another pull request. It has to go through our build pipeline. It has to get merged, then released. So you can see that so much more people get involved in the process, and it slows things a lot. And if we only had the tests, you would see it right away. And that's the reason why the cost can go up that high, and it really does in some cases. And now to the hero of the presentation, let's go to what is Rest Assured. And rest assured is nothing more than a Java library for writing API tests. It's open source. It's built on top of HTTP Builder. And the one thing that's very important about Rest Assured, as the name suggests, it only handles RESTful APIs. So if you need to test SOAP APIs, this is not the tool to use. There are other things you can use, but Rest Assured is not one of them. It's a Java DSL. So we'll see it in a second how easy it is to write tests with Rest Assured. And as long as it is a RESTful API, it works with XML, with JSON, with HTML, and with plain text responses as well. And why use Rest Assured in the first place? Well, it removes the need to write a lot of boilerplate, and usually you would have to, before you start writing tests, you have to write methods to send a request, then you have to write methods to parse the response. You have to figure out how to set all of the parameters in the request, the headers, the content types, query parameters, path parameters, whatever you need. And then you have to figure out how to parse it all. And Rest Assured comes pre-built with that, so you don't have to worry about it. And it saves a lot of time. And tests are structured using the BDT or behavior-driven development notation, using the given when then syntax that we'll see in a second. And it works on top of popular testing frameworks like JUnit, TestNG, and Spock. And since it works on top of those frameworks, it's very easy to integrate into any CI pipeline, Jenkins or Bamboo, whatever you use. And last but very important, it's probably one of the most commonly used libraries for writing API tests. It has a very good documentation and a very big community. So if you need a question answered, it will probably be documented, or you can find a person to answer that question very, very easily. You don't have to worry, all right, so no one uses that framework. If I have a problem, what do I do? That's not the case here. And how to set up Rest Assured. I'm assuming that most of you using Java, you're using one of the build systems like Maven or Gradle or Antion, and you just have to add the Rest Assured dependency, and it comes pre-bundled with everything you need. So in the case of Maven, as I showed here, you just have to include it in your POM XML or in the the build Gradle file if you're using Gradle, and that's all you need to do. You have Rest Assured now. And now for the basic syntax, as I said, it uses the so-called BDD notation or given when then syntax, which is very easy to read and understand. And it gives you a setup, execution, and verification in a single line. You don't have to document the tests, because I've seen tests which require comments to figure out what's happening in them. And if you reach that point that you have to write comments, so you have to explain what you're doing, yeah, you have to think twice about what you're trying to achieve here. And Rest Assured, as the test type showed here, very basic test. The given is pretty much our setup. The when is our execution phase, and the then is our verification phase, in which we try to assert our response with whatever we decide. And in that test, for example, we just set the content type to JSON. We get some example endpoint, and we assert that the status code is 200. That's all it does. And as you can see, it's very easy to understand. When you just look at it, you immediately know what it's supposed to do. And of course, Rest Assured gives you pre-built methods with about adding query parameters and path parameters. And it's very easy. You pretty much supply a map. In the case of query parameters, you just call the param method and you give the key and value pairs of your request parameters. And it also supports, we'll see later in the demo, that you can actually, if you have a query parameter which takes a list, you can also pass a list to the param and it will interpret it just fine. And for the path parameters, there are multiple ways to do it as well. One of them is to just use the path param method, and you would supply again a map of the key that you want to replace and the value. In that case, it's hotel ID and room number. And rest assured also gives you a lot of ways to verify response data. One of them is Hamcrest matchers. I don't know how many of you use Hamcrest, but it's pretty much a library about matching, and it gives you so many methods, like you can check that something's equal, starts with, you can check collections, if it contains elements, the size of collections, um, and all kinds of stuff. There is more than 100 methods in Hamcrest, and whatever you need probably is there as well. And in case you can't find it, you can also use Groovy matchers. And in the example below, I don't know how many of you got some exposure to Groovy, but Groovy is an awesome language, especially with collections. It has so many pre-built features in there. And if we go to that case here, what I'm doing is I'm calling the get endpoint users. And then what I'm doing in the assertion is first I'm finding from the response all of the address objects. I'm filtering them by suit, and I'm actually searching for a suit which contains apartment. And then from those objects, I'm getting the city values. And once I extract the city values, I assert that the items that I showed, like South Christie, South Elvis, and Glenboro, are in there. And that's all we're doing. And of course, if you can't write your assertion in Hamcrest or Groovy, because sometimes they're very complex, you can write whatever you want. Sky is the limit here. And of course, in some tests, you don't just need to make one request. You have to make multiple requests, reuse data from the first one, pass it to the second one, and rest assured gives you a way to do that as well using the extract method. And there are also a few tools that we'll see later, which are called JSONPath and XMLPath. Of course, they help you extract values from JSON and XMLs. And in the example that I've given below, we are just calling the extract method on the response. And after we got that, we get the response saved to a variable. And then from that variable, you can pretty much extract the key that you want. In our case, the ID and the email. And it's that simple. You don't have to do anything else. One other thing that Rest Assured gives you is JSON schema validation. What a JSON schema is pretty much a specification for what a JSON should contain, what the field should be, what their data type is, even if what the order should be in the JSON. And Rest Assured gives you a method which takes a JSON schema and it applies it to your response, so you can immediately verify in one line that the response that you received actually contains all the fields that you expect from that endpoint. And also here I include a link, a very cool online tool. It's called a JSON schema tool, and it just takes an example response and it will generate a JSON schema for you. And except the JSON schema, if you're working with XML, the rest assured supports the same methods for XML and XSDs. You can match DDTs, and pretty much it's the same. There is no difference. One is called match JSON schema, other is called match XML schema, and just the data format is, well, it's not slightly different, it's a lot different, but you know what the difference is. And now about authentication. As you know, we have a lot of APIs, I hope all of them, but that's not always the case, require some authentication. And Rest Assured supports the most common types of authentication. One of them is basic. And as you can see here, you just have to supply the username and password. And that just happens when you call the auth method and you say, I want to use basic authentication. Then you supply your username and password key value pair, and that's it. And Rest Assured supports preemptive and challenge authentication. And if you don't know what the difference is, in a preemptive authentication, Rest Assured will immediately send the username and password when you make the request. And from the challenge type of basic authentication, it wouldn't actually send them. It would it will expect the server to challenge the request and say, send me your authentication credentials, and then it will authenticate to the server. And it supports both of those types. It supports OAuth as well, OAuth 1 and 2. And in that case, you just have to pass an authentication token. That's all you need to do. And it supports digest and form authentication as well, certificate authentication as well, which they work the same way as most of the times, like basic authentication. You just apply username and password or certificate, and that's it. And if I'm going too fast, we'll see those things later in the demo, so don't worry. One thing which Rest Assured gives you is the so-called spec builders and specifications. And what those are nothing more than a reusable set of properties and verification and validation checks. So if you find that in a lot of tests, you're repeating the same assertion over and over again, Rest Assured gives you the ability to make the so-called specification, which you can apply to every request that you make. So you don't have to repeat the same lines of code again and again. And you can make a request and a response specification. So you can apply that to both the request and the response. Rest Assured also supports the so-called filters. And filters, if you're familiar with aspect-oriented programming or in Aspect-J, they are familiar to the around annotation. So they pretty much allow you to intercept a request or a response. And in the case of a request, just before it's sent to the server, you can intercept it and modify some fields in there. Let's say that you always want to include a header in the request, and that filter is a way to make sure that always happens, even if you, in a test, you forgot to put the filter there, or you make a request which doesn't contain the filter, not the filter, the header, excuse me. The filter will intercept that request and will put your header in there. Or the response, you can, before it's returned to the test, you can intercept the response, and you can, for example, check if the status code is between 400 and 500, which generally means there is some error in there. And you can apply custom logic to it. Let's say you want to log it. If the status code is between 400 and 500, you can do that with filters as well. And yeah, you can implement custom logging, session management, authentication schemes. All of those can be achieved with filters. And another very important feature is serialization and deserialization in Rest Assured. And Rest Assured pretty much can convert your Java objects to XML or JSON, and it can do that automatically depending on the content type. And by default, it will use the default Jackson object mapper. But if you wish, you can apply your custom data mapper in there. You don't have to use the default one. And deserialization happens using the S method. And again, in the example here, I'm just calling the get endpoint message. And I'm deserializing the response to a message class that I have created. And that's pretty much the automatic way to do it. And if you find that you can't use the automatic way, you need some custom logic in there, you can always create your custom object data mapper and apply that as well. And in the bottom, you can see that I'm using an object mapper type of JSON to deserialize my request. And that's everything there is to it. You just have to supply your custom data mapper if you require some additional logic to be put in there. And other cool features which Rest Assured supports are custom proxy configuration. You can proxy each request to whatever you want. You can supply the detailed encoder and decoder config. By default, Rest Assured gives that for you. But if you need something more specific, you can configure Rest Assured with your specification as well. You can configure SSL in Rest Assured, and which is the coolest model, which sadly is out of scope of this presentation, but it can be a completely different presentation of its own. It's Spring Mock MVC module. So if some of you use Spring Mock MVC to write integration or contract tests, Rest Assured gives you a very cool integration with that module. And yeah, if there is a interest in that, we can do a presentation about that as well, because it's super cool. And now, just before we go to the demo, I included a slide with some useful links. And one of them is the Rest Assured usage guide in GitHub, the official documentation. It's very good. So if you have interest, you can check it out. You'll find everything you need in there. Also, the Rest Assured mock MVC usage guide. I included the online tool that I use to generate JSON schemas, and online tool for generating POJOs from JSON or XML, which is also really cool. You just give your JSON and it will auto-generate a POJO for you. And the demo project that I'm going to show you right now also included a link to the GitHub repo. So if you wanna check it out or try it yourself, you can also do that. So now to the demo we go. All right. So do you wait a second, because I'm not sure you see the correct screen. All right. So you should see my IntelliJ now. Okay, so what I have right here is just a Gradle project, nothing more complex than that. And in the build Gradle file, I'm just going to show you what I have. In the build Gradle file, I just have the Rest Assured dependency, the JSON schema validation dependency that I talked about, I'm going to show you later. Rest Assured Spring Mock MVC, which I'm not using for this demo, but and Jackson. And I'm using JUnit for my test framework. That's all I have in my build Gradle, nothing more. Now let's go. I create the test config file, which pretty much holds the most important configurations that I'm going to use. Here I have my API paths. I'm using a public API. The base URI is this one. And you can see that Rest Assured gives you a few properties that you can set outright. And if we open the Rest Assured class, you can see what our properties are. You have a default URI, you have a body root path, you have default port, you have an undefined port, you have default paths, default authentication schemes, encoding, and session ID values, and those are default values. And here I just set my base URI to be the same as the API that I'm going to use. I set my JSON path config to use a character set of UTF-8. And I set to Rest Assured that the parser I'm going to use is JSON by default. And here I just have my API, my endpoint URIs. We have users with a path parameter that I'm going to show you how to use later. We have comments, album, photos, and I have a method about getting my API token, which just reads it from a config file, because I know what it is. And now let's go to some tests. Let's start with the get user test that we have here, and I'm extending the test config so I can get all of that configurations. And the first test is, I'm not even going to run it. It's just going to show how simple it is. We pretty much say, all right, I want to get endpoint users, which is this one. And I want you to check that my status code is 200. That's all it does. Nothing more, nothing less. And yeah, it's that simple to write a very basic test. That basic, I doubt anyone will use it that basic, but we go to the next test that we have. Here we have a user, and in this case, you can see that I'm calling a get endpoints users, and I'm concatenating my user ID to that endpoint, which in that case is 123. And that's one of the ways to add a path parameter. You can just concatenate it to your URI. And I'm checking that my status code is 200. And as you can see, that's a particular thing about the API I'm using. Actually, it always returns 200, which I don't even want to discuss about REST standards and so on, but it pretty much always returns a status code of 200. And it equals a result object in which it returns a different status code. and a message what happened. And as you can see here, I'm passing a username of user ID of 123, and I'm trying to get that user's endpoint without any authentication at all. And what I'm doing here is I'm verifying that my code here will be 401 and the message will be unauthorized. And what that root path here that I included does is I'll just run the test right now and you'll see it more clearly. All right, so since I'm logging everything, you can see that the result I got back is with a message unauthorized, with a name unauthorized, with a status code of 401. And what that line here root path result is, it pretty much sets what the root path is, and everything after that is just a child of the root path. So if you have 10 or 15 assertions that you want to write here, this one just saves you a little bit of typing, so you don't have to write result.status, result.name, result.code every time. You can just set the root path to result, and yeah, it saves you a little bit of typing. And what I do here, I'm also logging everything. And rest assured gives you that awesome log method that you can call on the request or the response. And it gives you quite a bit of options here. You can log everything or all. The difference between everything and all is none. They're the same method. I don't have an idea why rest assured include both of them, but you can log everything. You can log just the body. You can also log only if the validation fails. So only if something fails in our test, then we will put a log out there. And you can also log the cookies, the headers, and you can set a custom condition if it errors, what should happen. And in that case, I was just logging everything, and that's why you see in the log the headers. Here you have the status code, then you have headers of the request, the response, sorry, and then you have the body here, which contains the meta object and the result object. And that's all that test does. And here, in the next test, now I'm supplying the authentication token, as you can see, except setting the content type to JSON, I'm also saying that I want to authenticate using OAuth, and I'm giving the API token that I have. And now, when I get the same endpoint with user ID 123, now I'm actually expecting to get a 404, because I know that the user with ID 123 doesn't exist. And now we can see that if we run this, it will actually be the status code we expect, since now we're supplying the authentication token. And now we can see we got a 404 back. Yeah, that user doesn't exist. But now, at least we know how to authenticate to the API. And again, I'm logging everything here. And if you want to use basic authentication, it's the same thing. You just set I want to use authentication type basic, and you supply your username and password here, and you call the same endpoint. And if, as I mentioned before, you can use challenge authentication or preemptive authentication. In the case of preemptive, you can just supply it here as well. And you can say, all right, I want to use preemptive authentication type. And in that case, I'm actually expecting a 401, since I know that I wouldn't be able to authenticate with username, and password. And yeah, I can run that, but you all know what's going to happen. You'll see that since I don't have any logging in there, and the test passed, and I got nothing. I got nothing because I didn't put any logging in there. And later we'll see how we can actually make it so we don't have to supply what log type you want to use on each test, and you can make it more general. Here, I'm using the same endpoint, but now the assertion that I'm using is one of the Groovy assertions that I said I'm going to use. And here I'm again authenticating using an OAuth 2 token, I'm getting the same endpoint, I'm expecting 200. Now I'm logging only if the validation fails. And you can also supply different types of logging details. You can say the headers, the body, the cookies, or you can log everything. In that case, I decided just to log the body. And what that assertion does is, all right, we are iterating over the result object. We are searching for a result object that have first name, which equals Stefan. And after we find those, we're getting the email of Stefan. And we actually check that the collection that we get back has that item in there, which is some crazy email. And if we run that test, since we have walk only if the validation fails, we would expect that the test would pass and we would get nothing, which is the expected behavior. But now if I append some gibberish to the email address and run the test again, now we would expect the test to fail and to get walks. And yeah, since now the assertion failed, you can see that we walked the body of the request and we have a lot of users returned. And you can go and check, but none of them has the correct address. Or if you scroll down, you can see that one expectation failed. And pretty much the condition that we wrote doesn't match. We expect this email to be in there, but we actually got this one. So as you can see, the error logging is pretty good as well. You can right away figure out what happened. And here I showed you a simple header test. As I said, you can set all different types of headers and cookies to the request as well. And it's very simple, similar to path params. You just supply a header value, name value pair, and the same is for cookies. And in that test, I actually, sorry, in that test, I actually give some random header and some random cookie with my header, my value, and so on. And I'm logging here in the request. Oh, but let's just make it, yeah, let's just make it headers because we can. And you can insert from the response the headers and cookies as well if you wish. And in that case, I'm just asserting that the header content encoding is of type gzip. And if we run that test, we would expect only the headers to be walked from the request. And yep, that's what you can see. We have the headers of our request and our custom headers in there as well. So that's all it takes to set headers and cookies to the request. Here I have a simple test with API parameters. They're just a key value pair using the param method. I'm again authenticating using my token and setting a parameter of first name with the value Wilford. And again, I'm logging only if the validation fails, and I'm logging the body. And in that case, what I'm using, again, a Groovy matcher. I'm searching the results object, and I'm trying to figure out that none of the objects that I that I have returned doesn't contain that name, and that has a size of 0. So since we're supplying first name parameter to the endpoint, we expect only users with that first name to be returned. And here I'm just checking that there is no user with a name different than this. And if we run that, yeah, it will pass. Hopefully. Yeah, that's all it is. Again, no logging. Why? Because we included logging only if the validation fails. And pretty much that's all it takes to set a path parameter. We just supply a key value pair. And let's say that you have a path parameter that requires a list of objects. Rest assured gives you 2 ways to do that. You can just, the first way is just make a list. Let's make a list of string. And yeah, let's just say, I wouldn't even go further. And you can just supply your list here. And that's all it takes to make sorry, to pass a list to the path parameter. Another way to do it is by so-called varargs. And what you can do is just keep adding more. You can say, you can add more names here. And rest assured, smart enough to know that the first parameter is actually the parameter name, and everything else is a parameter value, and it will just append them and treat them as a list. And as I mentioned, there is different ways to pass a path parameter. One of them was just concatenating it to the API URI, and another way is just use the path_param method. And here I'm using that user by ID endpoint, which is parameterized. You can see that we have that user ID parameter, and I'm just saying to rest assured, I want the parameter with name user ID to be with that value, and rest assured will take care of that for you. And also, if you have multiple path parameters, like 3 of them or 4 of them, rest assured we'll just replace them in order. So it's more clear written in this way what you want to replace, user ID. But if you have 3 or 4, you can just pass them here, and rest assured we'll replace them in the order that they exist in your URI. In that test, I'm just checking that the first name is that one. Nothing more complex than that. Here I have a JSON schema test, which I mentioned that you can use. You can verify the whole structure of your JSON using a JSON schema. And I have one JSON schema here, the get user JSON schema, and you can see that it's very verbose. And if you're thinking that if I wrote this by myself, I did not. I used the online tool that I supplied in the presentation. I just gave an example response, and it generated all of this for me. And you can just call, I'm supplying with the file of my JSON schema here. I am just calling that user's endpoint again, and I'm saying that I want to match the body to the JSON schema that I supplied, and it's all it takes. If I manage to reach the API. Yep. The risks of live shows. Everything works until it doesn't. Oh, yeah, now it works. What happened is we wasn't able to reach the host by some reason. But yeah, that's all it takes. We just have to call the match JSON schema and supply the JSON schema. And now I want to show you some post endpoints, because if you noticed, all we did here is call get endpoints, verify the results. And I created a different class here, which is now we're going to try to create a user. And in the first test, I'm going to be using a JSON again. And this is my JSON for my user. I want to create a user with first name Ilya, last name Yanev, gender, email, phone, status, and so on. And I just want to pass that JSON to the post endpoint. And let's go over the test. What I'm doing is, first, I'm reading my JSON value as a string. And what I'm doing here is I'm calling that extract method, since after I post the user, I then want to call the get endpoint and verify that that user actually exists and is returned by the get endpoint. And here what I'm doing is, again, authenticating using my token. And here in the body of the request, I'm giving the user JSON that I just showed you. And here, as you can see, that I'm calling the post method because I want to hit the post endpoint, and the post endpoint is users. And I want to walk the body. Then I'm just checking that I got a 201 back, which means that my user was created. And now I'm going to that JSON path that I mentioned. I'm just creating a new JSON path object. and I'm passing the body that I got back as a response here. That's the whole response actually, not just the body. And here I'm saying, all right, from that response, get the body as string, and I'm setting the root path to result as well, so I can save some typing down the line. And I'm saying that I want to save the ID that I got back from the endpoint, and I get that pretty much by calling the getString method. And I know that the key value, the the key of the value that I want is ID. So I'm getting it and persisting it in that string, which is named ID. And then I'm creating a different JSON path object. And now from the original JSON that I have, that I passed to the endpoint, I'm also extracting a few fields in there, which are first name, last name, gender, and date of birth. And I'm doing it the same way, creating a new JSON path object, passing my JSON that I originally passed to the endpoint, and saving all of those values in variables. And then I'm making a different GET request. And now I'm supplying the ID that I got from the response of my create user. And I expect that the result would match what I passed in the JSON at the first place. And that's all that this does. It reuses it extracts a value from the post endpoint result, and then it reuses it to make a different get endpoint. And you can see that the test actually passed. You can see that we successfully created a new user. We got that 201 back. That's what the result was. Our user was created. And then we called the get endpoint and verify that it's actually returned. And another way to do this, by not using JSON strings, is actually serialize the response. And rest assured, can do this automatically for you. But since in my case, you can see that I have some meta tag, which is with underscore. I have some specific result tags. So I wasn't able to just say to rest assured, do it, and the rest assured should be able to figure out how to do it by its own. I just created a new create user object. And here I'm just have the fields that I want to set to my user, the same ones as the ones that existed in the JSON. And here I make my user object, and I'm expecting a base response to be returned, and I'll show you what the base response is in a second. I'm saying, all right, my content type is JSON. I want to post a request with body. And you can see here that for body, I'm actually supplying a Java object this time, not a JSON string. And the rest assured will actually, since I defined my Java object in the right way, rest assured will actually automatically serialize it. So it doesn't matter that in the previous test, I gave a JSON string, and now I'm giving a Java object here. Rest assured to automatically take care of that. I'm logging the body. And what I'm doing here is I'm deserializing the response with that S. And what I got back, I created a different object called a base response, which pretty much mirrors what I get back from the backend. And I had to include some custom JSON properties here. That's why I have Jackson in the first place. And we can see that the base response has two objects in there. One of them is our result, which is our user. And one of them is some meta information about the request, like success, the code, a message, and a rate limit. Since every request you made to that API, they limit how many requests you can make per minute. So that's what that rate limit object is. And with that as, I'm actually deserializing our response to that object here. And if I put a breakpoint here, I'm actually expecting to see a Java object, not just some string or response here. And you can see that our create user that we make here is indeed a Java object that I'm passing to the post endpoint, and the response that I have, which is named response, is actually deserialized to Java object as well. You can see that we have success, status code of true 201, we have a message, we have the rate limit deserialized, we have our user parameters. Some of them are no because I didn't set them. And pretty much rest assured took care of that as well. And the only thing you have to make sure is that if you have some custom fields that you want to serialize or deserialize, you just set the correct properties in here. Or maybe if you have some very specific logic, you can write a new custom data mapper as well. And if you write your data mapper, what you would do is just pass it as a second parameter here. That will be where your data mapper goes. And you can, as you can see, since I'm working with Java objects here, I'm just validating direct Java objects. I'm not using strings. So it can be very useful, especially if you want to reuse that object further down the road, to use a Java object instead of a string or a JSON. And one thing I didn't go over, and I want to, is the so-called spec builders. And as I mentioned, those are reusable sets of validations and or properties that you can set to your request. So if you noticed, I have a lot of code repetition here. I have every time I'm setting authentication here, accept types, status code validations. Every time I'm just repeating those, and you don't have to do that. You can actually use the so-called spec builders. And here in the test config, I created a request spec specification and a response specification. And in the request specification, just for the kicks of it, I added a custom header because I want every time to include that header in the request. I'm saying each request that you make, set the accept header to JSON, set the content type to JSON. And in each request, I want to use authentication of type O2. And the token that I want to supply is that one. And I'm saying in each request, walk the headers. And now, once I have my request specification, I can apply it to my tests. So I can reuse that set of checks here. I don't have to explicitly write them in the tests. I created a response specification as well. Here I'm just setting the content type to be JSON. I'm expecting a status code of 200. Then I'm validating actually in the body that I get back that I have a success of true, that I have a value of 200 for the code. And for the message I have, everything is working as expected. And a super awesome feature of Rest Assured actually gives you the ability to set an expected response time. So you can actually put a performance element into your tests. And here I'm saying expect a response time less than 2 seconds. So if a test takes more than 2 seconds, that would fail. And I'm just saying walk the body on each request. Response actually, since that's a response specification. And now let's see how we can apply those. And it's very easy. You can just, let's pick a test like this one. As you can see, setting the accept type, setting the authentication token, all of that is handled by our request specification here. So we can, everything we need to do is we can safely delete all of those. And you can say, I want to use a specification. And you can say, I want to use my request specification that I created. And then I'm getting the users, I'm validating status code, I'm logging validation. If validation fails the body, again, I can say, all right, I can reuse my spec. And here, as the response OK spec. And that test now would be reusing that specs that I just showed here. And we expect to walk the headers, which just happened. And here you see that our test failed. Why does it fail? Well, because we expect the response to take less than 2 seconds, and it just took a little over 2 seconds. And that's what made the test fail. And it's a super awesome feature in my opinion. And as the specifications you can see that you can supply a very common set of assertions that you can apply to a different set of tests. And for the logging, except setting it to request specifications, you can set it generally as well. Actually, you can say, if you wish, rest assured, not config, just rest assured. And you can say enable logging. Let's say that's what we want to do. Enable logging of request response if validation fails, because most of the cases that's what you want to do, since you don't just write excessive logs on successful test cases. And you can supply a log detail level here. So you can say that my log detail, I want to log the status, I want to log the body, cookies, or I just want to log everything. That's a different way to do that. And just the last thing that I'll go over fast is, of course, JUnit gives you the ability to go over different parameters and parameterize your tests. And you can just apply that to rest assured as well. Here you can see that I'm running with the parameterized class. I'm applying a set of parameters that I want to pass to a request. Here we have that's an ID, first name, last name, and email. And here I'm reusing that request spec. I'm actually getting a user with an ID of our first parameter here. And with the response, I'm using our response OK spec. And I'm validating that we get the same values that we expect here. And oh, yeah. And now we'll see that some will pass, some will fail. And you can again look at what's happening here. You can see that our first user actually is the test failed because it took more than 2 seconds. In our second test case, the requested resource doesn't exist because we expected 200 and we actually get a 404 back. Some passed, some didn't pass, but the idea is that you have a very clear walk so you can very fast figure out what's happening. So yeah, I took more time than I expected, but those were the basic features that I wanted to show. So sorry for taking a little bit more, but now we can move on to questions, actually, finally. So yeah, we'll
Does
give it to...
any of you have additional questions that you can ask them in the chat? To remind you, it's in the bottom of your screen, almost in the middle of it. Okay. Looks like we don't have any questions. Anyway, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. It was great pleasure. We had over 100 participants. That was our first webinar, like I said, so any feedback is really welcomed. You can directly email me with the confirmation email I send you through to join this webinar, or I'll be sending you a feedback form. So both of those work fine. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us today, and I hope to see you soon. Our next event is on the 12th of May and is something between DevOps and cloud. So if something like this sounds interesting to you, you can join. It's again free of charge, so hope to see you there. Okay guys, I'll be ending this meeting. Thanks again everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you guys. See ya.